June 15, 1944, Saipan Island. Japanese Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto watched in horror as American artillery shells landed with surgical precision, hitting bunkers hidden for months while leaving nearby positions untouched, something that should have been impossible with 1940s technology. Within hours, the same defenders who had sworn to die for the emperor were surrendering in record numbers, not from cowardice, but from a terrifying realization about their enemy's true capabilities. But what Yamamoto discovered as an American prisoner would shatter everything he thought he knew about warfare, strength, and which side was really winning this war. So what could be so shocking that it would make a samurai warrior question his entire worldview?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hot June sun beat down on Saipan Island in 1944. Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto wiped sweat from his face as he checked his rifle for the third time that morning. The metal was so hot it burned his hands. Around him, other Japanese soldiers crouched in their hidden bunkers, waiting for the Americans to attack. Yamamoto had been fighting for 3 years. He was 26 years old, but felt much older. His grandfather had been a samurai warrior. His father had served the emperor in China. Now it was his turn to die with honor for Japan. This was what every Japanese boy learned from birth. Death before shame, victory or death. The emperor was like a god, and Japan could never lose because the gods protected them. But things were not going well for Japan in 1944. Food was running low. The rice rations got smaller each week. Their guns were old. Some soldiers had to share bullets. The radios barely worked. Many of their ships had been sunk. Still, the officers told them Japan was winning. They said the Americans were weak and soft. Americans loved money and comfort too much to fight hard. The Japanese spirit would beat American machines. Yamamoto's bunker was dug deep into the rocky hill. It had taken his men 2 months to build. They used picks and shovels to cut through solid rock. The entrance was hidden behind thick bushes. From the outside, no one could see it. Inside, they had stored rice, water, and ammunition. The bunker could hold 8 men. It had thick walls that could stop tank shells. At least, that's what the engineers had promised. The morning was quiet, except for the sound of waves hitting the beach below. Seabirds called to each other. It felt peaceful, but Yamamoto knew better. American ships sat just past the horizon. Everyone could see the black smoke from their stacks. There were more ships than anyone had ever seen before. Some soldiers counted over 200. Others said there were even more. For days, nothing had happened. The Americans just sat there, waiting. This made the Japanese soldiers nervous. What were they planning? In China, enemies attacked quickly. Here, the Americans took their time. They seemed to be studying the island like scientists, studying bugs.
Then, at exactly 10 in the morning, the first shell landed. Yamamoto expected the usual thing. In China, artillery came down like rain. Hundreds of shells would fall everywhere at once. Most missed their targets. It was loud and scary, but soldiers could survive by hiding in deep holes. After an hour or two, the shelling would stop and the real fighting would begin. This was different. The first shell hit the ammunition dump exactly in the center. The dump was hidden in a cave 500 yards from Yamamoto's position. No one should have been able to see it from the water. The explosion shook the ground so hard that rocks fell from the bunker ceiling. Orange flames shot up through the cave opening like a giant blowtorch. Yamamoto looked at his men. Their eyes were wide with fear. How did the Americans know exactly where to aim? 5 minutes later, another shell landed. This one hit the command bunker where Colonel Sato had his headquarters. Again, it was a perfect hit. The bunker had been built to look like a pile of rocks. From the air or the sea, it should have been invisible, but the American shell found it like an arrow finding the center of a target. The radio crackled with confused voices. Officers were shouting questions. How were the Americans doing this? Did they have spies on the island? Were they using some kind of magic? Then came the third shell. It landed on the water storage tank that fed the eastern defense positions. The tank was buried underground, with only a small pipe showing above the surface. The shell hit the pipe exactly. Water began flowing down the hillside like a small river. Yamamoto felt something cold in his stomach that had nothing to do with the morning air. This was not random shooting. The Americans knew exactly where everything was. They could see things that should have been hidden. They were picking off the most important targets one by one, like a hunter choosing which animals to shoot. Private Ito crawled over to Yamamoto. His hands were shaking. "Sergeant, how do they know where to shoot? We built everything in secret. We worked only at night. We covered our tracks." Yamamoto had no answer. In all his years of fighting, he had never seen anything like this. Artillery was supposed to be like throwing rocks with your eyes closed. You shot many times and hoped to hit something important. But these Americans were shooting like they had perfect vision. They could see through rock and dirt and bushes.
Another shell whistled overhead. This one hit the fuel depot behind the main ridge. Again, a perfect strike. Black smoke rose into the clear sky. The smell of burning gasoline mixed with the salt air from the ocean. For the first time in his life, Yamamoto began to wonder if everything he had been told was true. If the Americans were weak and stupid, how could they do this? If Japanese spirit was stronger than American machines, why were those machines so much better than anything Japan had ever built? The question scared him more than the shells. The shelling went on for 6 more hours. By late afternoon, every important target on the island had been hit. The water was gone. The ammunition was destroyed. The radios were dead. Most of the officers were buried under tons of rock and dirt. Yamamoto's bunker was one of the few left standing, but it didn't matter anymore. There was nowhere to run and nothing left to fight with. When the American soldiers came up the beach, Yamamoto was ready to die. He had 1 bullet left in his rifle. Japanese soldiers were taught never to surrender. Death was better than shame. But when he tried to pull the trigger, his hands would not work. A piece of metal from an exploded shell had cut deep into his shoulder. Blood soaked through his uniform. His vision was getting blurry. The American soldiers found him lying against the bunker wall. He waited for them to shoot him or stick him with bayonets. That's what Japanese soldiers did to prisoners. That's what the officers said Americans did too. Americans were cruel and evil. They tortured prisoners for fun. Instead, one of the Americans knelt down beside him. The soldier was young, maybe 20 years old. He had kind eyes and gentle hands. He looked at Yamamoto's wound and said something in English. Then he opened a small bag and pulled out bandages and medicine. He cleaned the wound carefully and wrapped it with white cloth that was softer than anything Yamamoto had ever felt. 2 more Americans arrived with a stretcher. They lifted Yamamoto as gently as they would lift their own wounded friend. He kept waiting for the pain and cruelty to begin, but it never came. They carried him down to the beach where a big boat waited in the shallow water. On the boat there was a room full of wounded men. Some were Americans with bandages on their arms and legs. Some were Japanese soldiers like himself. But they were all lying on the same clean beds. They all got the same medicine. A man in a white coat moved from bed to bed, checking everyone with the same careful attention. Yamamoto could not understand this. Why would Americans waste medicine on Japanese prisoners? The boat took them to a huge ship that looked like a floating city. Yamamoto had never seen anything so big. The ship was longer than his entire village back home. It had more rooms than the biggest castle in Japan. Everything was made of steel and painted white or gray. The floors were so clean they reflected the ceiling lights like mirrors. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. They put him in a hospital room with 4 beds. The sheets were pure white and smelled like flowers. The mattress was soft and thick. At home, he had always slept on a thin mat on the floor. There was a window with glass so clear he could see through it like air. Next to his bed was a table with a lamp, a pitcher of fresh water, and a stack of magazines. A Japanese-American soldier came to talk to him. This confused Yamamoto even more. The man looked Japanese but wore an American uniform. He spoke perfect Japanese and explained that he was there to help translate. Yamamoto asked him why he fought for America instead of Japan. The translator smiled and said America was his home. His family had lived there for 30 years. America was the land of freedom, he said. That night, they brought Yamamoto dinner on a metal tray. There was more food than he had seen in months. There was meat, potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, and a piece of cake with white frosting. The bread was soft and sweet. The meat was tender and juicy. There was so much that he could not finish it all. When he asked for seconds, they brought him another full tray without question. The next morning, they moved him to a prison camp on a different island. But this prison was not like anything he had imagined. There were clean buildings with electricity and running water. There was a kitchen that could feed 1,000 men at once. There were rooms for reading and writing letters home. There was even a small hospital with real doctors and nurses. The American guards carried guns, but they used them mainly to protect the prisoners from each other during arguments. Most of the time, the guards talked and joked with the prisoners. Some guards shared cigarettes and candy. One guard showed Yamamoto pictures of his own family back in Iowa. His wife and children looked happy and well-fed. On his 3rd day in the camp, a truck arrived that made Yamamoto think he was dreaming. It was painted bright red and white with pictures of bottles on the sides. Music played from a speaker on top. The truck stopped in the middle of the camp and a man began handing out bottles of dark liquid with ice. The prisoners lined up like children getting treats at a festival. When Yamamoto tasted the drink, his eyes went wide. It was sweet and cold and bubbly. It tasted better than anything he had ever drunk. The translator told him it was called Coca-Cola. In America, the man said, even children drank this every day. It cost only 5 cents a bottle. Most Americans bought several bottles a week without thinking about the money. Yamamoto sat under a tree and watched American soldiers unload boxes of food from another truck. There were cans of fruit, bags of rice, fresh vegetables, and loaves of bread. Everything looked perfect and clean. There was enough food to feed his entire unit for a month, but this was just one day's delivery to one small prison camp. That night, lying on his soft bed with a full stomach, Yamamoto began to realize something that made him afraid to think too deeply. If America could afford to feed prisoners this well, how much food did regular American families have? If they could waste medicine on enemy soldiers, how good was their medicine for their own people? If their prison camps were cleaner and more comfortable than most Japanese homes, what were their real cities like? For the first time since his capture, Yamamoto began to wonder if Japan had started a fight with the wrong enemy. November 23rd arrived cold and gray, but something felt different in the camp that morning. The American guards seemed happier than usual. They smiled more and talked in excited voices. Some prisoners asked the translator what was happening. He explained that it was Thanksgiving Day, the most important holiday for American families. It was a day when everyone gathered to eat together and think about the good things in their lives. Yamamoto had been in the camp for 5 months now. His shoulder had healed completely. He could move his arm without pain. His body had grown stronger from eating regular meals. But his mind felt more confused every day. Nothing about America matched what his teachers and officers had told him. Every day brought new surprises that made him question everything he thought he knew. That morning, the kitchen workers started cooking before sunrise. Strange smells filled the air. Sweet smells mixed with rich, meaty odors. The prisoners could hear pots and pans clanging together. Ovens opened and closed with loud bangs. Someone was preparing something very special. At noon, the guards told all the prisoners to gather in the main dining hall. The room was bigger than most buildings in Yamamoto's village. Long tables filled the space from wall to wall. Each table was covered with a white cloth. There were plates and forks and knives at every seat. Everything was clean and shiny. Then the kitchen doors opened, and workers began carrying out the food. Yamamoto could not believe his eyes. They brought whole roasted birds that were bigger than chickens. The translator said they were turkeys, and each one weighed more than 20 pounds. The skin was golden brown and glistening with juices. Steam rose from the meat like incense at a temple. But the turkeys were just the beginning. They brought bowls of mashed potatoes so white and fluffy they looked like clouds. There were green beans with tiny pieces of bacon. There was stuffing made from bread and herbs that smelled like a garden after rain. There were cranberries that gleamed like red jewels. There was gravy so rich and thick it coated the spoon. And the workers kept coming with more food. Sweet potatoes topped with melted sugar. Corn that had been cut from fresh cobs. Rolls that were warm and soft as pillows. Butter that melted the moment it touched the hot bread. And finally, pies. Apple pies and pumpkin pies and cherry pies with crusts that were golden and flaky. Each prisoner got a plate piled so high with food that some of it fell onto the table. The guards served themselves from the same dishes and sat down to eat with the prisoners. There was no separation between captors and captives. Everyone shared the same meal like members of one big family. Yamamoto took his first bite of turkey and nearly cried. The meat was so tender it fell apart with just a fork. The flavor was rich and satisfying in a way that made his whole body feel warm. He had never tasted anything so good. At home, his family ate meat maybe once a month, and it was usually just a small piece of fish or a thin slice of pork. As he ate, he listened to the conversations around him. The American guards talked about their families back home. They showed pictures of their wives and children. They talked about the big meals their mothers and grandmothers were cooking in kitchens across America. One guard said his family always ate turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, 3 different kinds of pie, and at least 6 other dishes. Another guard laughed and said his grandmother made so much food that they ate leftovers for a week. This was when the terrible truth hit Yamamoto like a physical blow to his chest. This meal, which was the most amazing feast he had ever seen, was normal for Americans. This was how prisoners ate on just one special day. If American prisoners ate like kings, how did regular American families live? If they could afford to waste this much food on enemy soldiers, how much abundance did they have at home? He thought about his own family back in Japan. His mother had not tasted meat in over a year. His little sister had grown thin and weak from eating nothing but rice and vegetables. His father worked in a factory making bullets and bombs, but the family got smaller food rations every month. Everyone in Japan was hungry. Everyone was tired. Everyone was afraid. But here, in this prison camp, surrounded by enemy soldiers, Yamamoto was eating better than Japanese officers. He was sleeping on a softer bed than most Japanese generals. He had access to medicine and doctors and clean water and hot showers. The Americans were treating their prisoners better than Japan treated its own people. The thought made him feel sick and dizzy. Everything he had been taught was a lie. Japan was not winning this war. Japan could not win this war. America was so much stronger and richer than Japan that the fight was like a mouse challenging a lion. Japanese spirit and honor meant nothing against American power and resources.
He remembered the precise artillery that had destroyed his unit. Now he understood why it was so accurate. America had better technology because America had better scientists and engineers. America could build better weapons because America had more money and materials. America could afford to be precise instead of wasteful because America had so much of everything.
But the most frightening realization was still to come. If America was this powerful, why had they not simply wiped Japan off the map in the first week of the war? They clearly had the ability to destroy every Japanese city, every Japanese ship, every Japanese soldier without breaking a sweat. So why were they taking their time? Why were they being so careful? Why were they treating prisoners so well? The answer came to him as he finished his second piece of pie. America was being merciful. They were showing restraint not because they were weak, but because they were strong. Only a nation that was completely confident in its power could afford to be gentle with its enemies. Only people who had already won could afford to be kind. Yamamoto set down his fork and stared at his empty plate. For the first time in his life, he understood what real strength looked like. It was not the loud, desperate strength of Japan, screaming about honor while its people starved. It was the quiet, confident strength of America, so sure of victory that it could waste turkey and pie on prisoners of war. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Yamamoto heard the emperor's voice on the radio, telling all Japanese people to surrender. The voice was thin and weak, not like the powerful God voice he had imagined all his life. Even through the crackling radio, the emperor sounded like a tired old man who had given up hope. It took 8 more months before Yamamoto could go home. The Americans had to organize ships and trains to move thousands of prisoners back to Japan. They gave each prisoner a new set of clothes, a bag of food for the journey, and a small amount of money. Some prisoners also got letters of reference from American officers, saying they had been good workers and honest men. The ship that carried Yamamoto home was crowded and uncomfortable, but it was still better than most Japanese transport ships had been during the war. There was enough food and clean water for everyone. The American sailors treated the Japanese prisoners with the same quiet respect they had shown in the camps. When the ship reached Tokyo Bay in April 1946, Yamamoto stood at the rail and stared at his homeland. What he saw made his heart feel heavy as stone. The great city of Tokyo was mostly gone. Where there had once been millions of wooden houses and shops, now there were only empty lots filled with ash and twisted metal. A few concrete buildings stood like broken teeth in a skull. Thin streams of smoke still rose from some areas, as if the city was still burning 9 months after the last bombing raid. The train ride to his village took 2 days instead of the usual 8 hours. Many of the railroad bridges had been destroyed. The train had to take long detours around bombed areas. Sometimes it stopped for hours while workers cleared debris from the tracks. Through the window, Yamamoto saw city after city that looked like Tokyo. Japan had been crushed as completely as an egg under a hammer.
When he finally reached his village, he almost did not recognize it. Half the houses were gone. The rice fields were brown and empty because there had not been enough men to plant and harvest the crops. The village temple had a hole in its roof where a piece of metal from an airplane had fallen through. He found his family's house at the end of the main street. The roof had been patched with pieces of tin and cardboard. The paper walls had holes that were covered with old newspapers. His mother answered the door when he knocked. She was so thin he could see the bones in her face.
Her hair had turned completely white. She looked like an old woman, but she was only 45 years old. She cried when she saw him. She had thought he was dead for 2 years. His father came out of the house walking with a stick. He had been injured in a factory accident and could not work anymore. His little sister, who had been 12 when he left for the war, was now 15 but looked younger. Her arms were like sticks and her clothes hung loose on her small body. That night, the family shared a meal of thin soup made from vegetables and a small amount of rice. It was the first meat they had tasted in months. Yamamoto's mother apologized for having so little food to offer her son. She said they were lucky to have even this much. Many families in the village were eating grass and tree bark to stay alive. Yamamoto thought about the Thanksgiving dinner he had eaten in the prison camp. One American prisoner meal had contained more food than his entire family had eaten in the past month. The contrast made him feel sick and angry, but not at the Americans. He was angry at the Japanese leaders who had started a war they could never win while their own people starved. The next morning, he walked through the village and saw American soldiers giving out food and medicine. There was a long line of people waiting for rice and canned meat. Children who looked like walking skeletons held out their hands for chocolate bars and chewing gum. The American soldiers were gentle with everyone, especially the children. They smiled and tried to speak a few words of Japanese. Yamamoto got in line with the others. When he reached the front, the American officer looked at his reference letter and smiled. The officer spoke some Japanese and asked if Yamamoto would like to work as a translator. The Americans needed help talking to the local people about food distribution and medical care. Yamamoto said yes. Working with the Americans felt natural after his time in the prison camp. He understood now that they were not the evil demons Japanese propaganda had described. They were just people trying to help other people. They had won the war completely, but instead of punishing Japan, they were feeding Japanese children and rebuilding Japanese cities. Over the next few months, Yamamoto helped distribute food and supplies to dozens of villages. He saw American doctors treating Japanese patients with the same care they gave to American soldiers. He watched American engineers working to repair bridges and power plants that would help Japanese people, not American people. He translated while American teachers showed Japanese students how to grow better crops and build stronger houses. One day, in the summer of 1947, Yamamoto was translating for an American doctor who was treating sick children in a mountain village. The doctor had driven his jeep for 6 hours over bad roads to reach this remote place. He brought medicine that probably cost more than most Japanese families earned in a year. He spent the whole day examining children and giving them shots to prevent disease. When the village leader tried to pay him, the doctor just smiled and shook his head. As they drove back down the mountain that evening, Yamamoto asked the doctor why he worked so hard to help Japanese people. The doctor was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said that his own son was about the same age as the children in the village. He said that all children deserve to be healthy and happy, no matter what country they came from. He said this was what America meant by freedom, the freedom to help others without expecting anything in return. That night, Yamamoto wrote a letter to his former commander, who was still in prison. He told him about the American doctor and the rebuilt bridges and the food distributions. He tried to explain how wrong they had been about America, but he knew his commander would never understand. Some people's minds were too small to hold such a big truth. By 1950, Yamamoto had learned enough English to start his own business helping American companies work with Japanese suppliers. His family's house had a new roof and glass windows. His sister was healthy and going to school. His father had found work in a factory that made parts for American cars. The whole country was getting stronger and richer by working with America instead of fighting against it. Slowly, he began to understand what real strength looked like. It was not the loud, angry strength that Japan had shown when it attacked Pearl Harbor. It was not the desperate, cruel strength that Japanese officers had used to control their own soldiers. Real strength was quiet and confident. It did not need to prove itself by hurting others. It showed itself by helping others, even former enemies.
Years later, when Yamamoto had become a successful businessman, helping American and Japanese companies work together, people would ask him what he had learned during the war. He would think for a moment, remembering the precision of American artillery, the abundance of American prison camps, and the gentleness of American occupation forces. Then he would say, "I learned that true strength shows itself through restraint. America's most terrifying weapon was not their artillery's precision, it was their capacity for mercy when victory was complete. Any nation can destroy its enemies. Only the strongest nations can afford to heal them." Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.